Tonight's sermon, the one that we'll kick off the series with, I've called Heavenly Treasures in Earthen Vessels. Heavenly Treasures in Earthen Vessels. First preached this sermon in Paris, Texas, I think around 1995 or 96. The title is taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7. And Paul writes there, "For we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us." As I said a moment ago, I first preached this at Victory Baptist Church in Paris when I was pastoring there. And we were blessed in that church to have one of the most amazing groups of young adults I've ever been around. It was a band of young men and women who really loved the Lord and were committed to serving Him, and they made it cool to be that way. They really had their act together, and they were an impressive group of young people. And I don't think I ever enjoyed being around a group more than I did those folks. One of the leaders of that group was a young man by the name of Curtis Blake. Curtis was in college at the time. I think he was majoring in fine arts. And believe me when I tell you, he was a fine artist. Curtis had a real talent for art and artistic things. And somehow when I first preached this sermon, it struck a nerve with Curtis. It really hit home with him and with his peers. And so he had a school project coming up, and he was to make, I don't know exactly what the instructions were, but he decided he would make a clay vessel. And he wanted it to look like an earthen vessel. And he was inspired to do so by that sermon. I don't think he really, and this is it right here, this earthen vessel right here. And if you look on the inside, I don't know how well you can see that, but you see how rugged and earthy it looks on the outside, and then on the inside it's a beautiful glazed blue. And I don't know if he expected it to turn out exactly like that, but he made that vessel and he presented it to me some weeks later after I'd preached that sermon, and he had dropped a little note in there, and it said, "Heavenly Treasure in Earthen." I want us to read the context of our text this evening so that we can get a better picture of what Paul is talking about when he says we have this heavenly treasure in earthen vessels. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I'm going to read the first 12 verses. "Therefore, since God in His mercy has given us this ministry, we do not lose heart. Instead, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not practice deceit, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by open proclamation of the truth, we commend ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled or hidden, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ." Sounds like he could have written that this week, doesn't it? "Who is the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made His light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Now we have this treasure." What treasure, Paul? Well, he just mentioned it. The knowledge of the glory of God. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this surpassingly great power is from God and not from us. We are hard pressed on all sides, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. So Paul, in these wonderfully eloquent words, talks about two things. Number one, he talks about the treasure, and number two, he talks about the vessel. So I want to start with number two first. Let's talk about this vessel, this earthen vessel. You know, some of Paul's harshest critics enjoyed pointing out that he wasn't much to look at. Paul was not the picture of health. He was not the tall, stately, robust leader like, say, George Washington, Paul was more like John Adams, you know, the short, rotund guy that doesn't look like he's in the greatest of health. We pretty well know that Paul had some sort of a health issue. We can't say absolutely for certain what it was, but we can be pretty doggone sure that we know what at least one of the things that Paul struggled with and dealt with physically. 2 Corinthians is a very personal letter for Paul, and it's one that he seems really emotionally wound up in, emotionally involved in. I go over to chapter 12 and verses 7 to 10. Let me read what he says there. So to keep me from becoming conceited, he says, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. That is why, for the sake of Christ, I delight in weaknesses, in insults. Notice he says insults. I said this is a personal letter because Paul was under attack. And you can tell from his demeanor and the way he wrote this letter that he was responding to some harsh criticisms from some critics, maybe inside the church and out. He said, I delight in weaknesses. I delight in these insults, in these hardships and persecutions and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I'm strong. So there's pretty good evidence that perhaps among other physical challenges or limitations, Paul suffered from some sort of malady in his eyes. Paul had poor eyesight. And some have suggested that maybe he had a disease such as ophthalmia, which we also call conjunctivitis, which I used to hear that term when I was a younger man. I never hear much about it anymore, but maybe it's because I don't have babies. A lot of times babies will get that matted up mess in their eyes, and it'll be some form of conjunctivitis, which just sounds nasty to me. And it causes the eyes to swell and ooze, and it impairs vision. And some have suggested that Paul suffered from ophthalmia or conjunctivitis. The book of Romans, the longest of Paul's letters, for instance, Paul didn't write Romans. Paul dictated the words, and they were written down by a secretary, by a young man named Tertius, who was one of Paul's supporters and one of his administrative assistants, if you will. And it was Tertius who penned the letter of Romans, and we know that because in Romans chapter 16 and verse 22, when the letter's being wrapped up, Tertius throws in a personal greeting, and he said, I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, greet you in the Lord. So it was a long letter, and Paul didn't write it. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 11, Paul talks about how he did write the letter to the Galatians, and he talks about it being such a large letter that he wrote with his own hand. Now, some versions of the Bible used a plural, large letters. So there might be some confusion as to whether we're talking about the length of the letter itself, which is a fairly lengthy letter, or are we talking about the size of the letters that Paul wrote the letter in. Either way, Paul does bother to point out that it was an effort on his part to personally write out that letter. He wasn't going to wait for somebody to come that he could dictate it to. It was an urgent message that he wanted to get to the church. And so he stops down in 6:11 to point out, hey, this is important. I wrote it with my own hand. That obviously wasn't something Paul often did, probably because of poor eyesight. In 1 Corinthians and in 2 Thessalonians, Paul adds his own salutation to the end of those letters because he obviously didn't write them by hand himself. It makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that Paul might have had an eye malfunction, because if you remember the dramatic thing that happened to him on the road when he was met Christ, when he had that conversion experience, we're told that he was blinded and that he remained in that condition for some days. So Paul was that eyesight problem may have actually originated there. It may have been something from birth, but in one way or another, it appears that Paul did not have great vision. In the second letter to the Corinthians, which is our concern for this sermon, Paul seems especially stung by the criticism of those who tried to discount his importance based on his physical weakness and maladies. I think to put it in modern terms, we'd say it ticked him off. I'd say something else, but my mom might be listening. Paul was not happy with some folks who were criticizing him and accusing him of, weakness. And as a matter of fact, if we go over to chapter 10, we can read some verses there, beginning in verse number 9. He said, I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you by my letters, he says. For some people say, quote, his letters are weighty and forceful, but his physical presence is unimpressive and his speaking is of no account, end quote. So there were people saying, he's not a very dynamic speaker, and he's not much to look at. He's kind of weak and he's sick. Boy, he sure talks big when he's behind the pen. He says in verse 11, such people should consider that what we are in our letters when absent, we will be in our actions when present. Paul's like, listen, you chicken-livered so-and-sos, you're going to find out just how powerful my presence can be when I get there. So Paul was aggravated, obviously, by the criticisms that came his way that were based on his lack of physical prowess. But the flesh is weak. If you ever feel inadequate to represent Christ because maybe you're not much to look at, or you're not that well spoken, or maybe you have trouble just getting out of bed in the morning because of some physical challenge, I just want you to know you're in good company. You're in good company. Nobody's perfect. I've often thought about and I kind of referenced this in a sermon a couple of weeks ago, but I've often thought about the contrast between the two great leaders of the early church, Peter versus Paul. On one hand, you have Peter, this dashing, daring, dynamic, physical specimen, ready to mix it up at any time, ready to draw the sword and cut off a guy's ear if that's what's necessary or what he thinks is necessary. He's ready to put up his dukes and get after it. He's so secure. We read this a couple of weeks ago as well. He's so secure in his manhood that sometimes when he goes fishing, he just takes off all his clothes and fishes that way. I mean, he was a physical specimen. I believe that. He was tanned, his flesh was tanned in the sun. I think he might have been tall and good looking and just had all the physical attributes you would hope to have. But he wasn't much for writing. He wasn't very learned. He didn't have any degrees from any schools, any religious schools. And all we have from Peter, is his story, which is told by others, and a couple of short epistles that were written by him. And I think there's evidence that Peter sort of envied Paul's intellect. He even referenced it once, saying something like, hey, Paul says some good things. I know you folks are having trouble understanding it because, hey, if you don't have a degree in language arts, he's hard to follow. Sometimes I have to wear Google out just to keep up with him. I think Peter kind of felt that, a little bit of an intimidation factor by Paul's intellect. On the other hand, Paul might have been somewhat wishful that he was more like Peter. I wonder maybe if some of the early Christians, some of their contemporaries, might have sat around their campfires and talked about, man, wouldn't it be something if we could take the best parts of Peter and the best parts of Paul and put them together? You'd basically have a Greek God preaching Christ. You'd have Peter's physical prowess and Paul's intellect, but that's not how it worked out. That's not how it ever works. Each of them was imperfect, just like you and just like me. Hey, the container is just the container.